I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by my friend, the Honorable David Collenette, for a conversation on one of the biggest topics dominating conversations, certainly in Europe, and that is defense and NATO. So, David, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you, Jackie. It's great to be here.
And to say that you have extensive and diverse experience in defense is probably a gross understatement. In addition to decades serving Canada as a member of parliament and a minister in various portfolios under three prime ministers, you were Minister of Defense at a really critical time and you oversaw Canada's response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And then after retiring from Parliament in 2004, you've been advising global defense companies, among many, many other things. So it doesn't sound like much of a retirement to me. So how do you see the rapid increase in global conflicts and the diversification of threats such as cyber warfare, AI-driven disinformation, and hybrid warfare reshaping the way countries, including NATO members, are approaching their defense strategies and investments?
Well, that's a very loaded question, and I'm speaking not only as a former politician, but as someone who is the chair of the NATO Association of Canada.
Mm.
So I am involved with this on a daily basis. Our organization is spreading the word, is educating Canadians about NATO, and what is happening in recent weeks is alarming. Absolutely alarming. We have the Americans, which underpinned world security after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, President Truman, the creation of NATO, and it is now being threatened by the current administration. And I just don't understand. I understand their priorities may be shifting towards China and the Far East, but we cannot leave Europeans vulnerable. But this means that Europeans are going to have to perhaps pick up more of the load themselves. But you're right about all the different types of warfare. I mean, this is just not about guns and bombs. This is about cyber attacks, the hybrid warfare. You see somebody mysteriously poisoned in Salisbury in England. You see someone pushed off a window ledge in another capital, or cables cut in the Baltic, undersea cables cut. And so this is another way of conducting warfare, and also trying to influence elections. In Canada, we've had a big issue, and it's become quite a controversial one in the last year. And there's been a commission that's just reported on it about foreign interference in our elections. And of course, we're about to go into an election in the next month or two as a result of Mr. Trudeau resigning.
Yeah, so it is a very complex world that we're operating in now on many fronts. You highlighted in terms of election interference. Most people wouldn't be thinking along those lines when it comes to protecting our citizens or our countries or our strategic assets. I think that whole defense conversation has really expanded into security and protecting our ways of life. So you mentioned that you've obviously engaged with NATO throughout your career, and you mentioned that you're currently chair of the NATO Association of Canada. So maybe on NATO, because there have been so many headlines and certainly rhetoric coming out of the U.S. administration at times. As NATO adapts to this evolving threat landscape, we've been discussing. Particularly the challenges like deterrence in cyberspace and AI-driven security and risks. Other than what we see in the headlines, how is the alliance really being perceived globally, both by members and non-member states? And are there shifts in alliances or defense priorities that you think will shape NATO's role in the coming decade?
Well, it's a good question. NATO has been seized of all the issues that you've just talked about. And we hosted Jan Stoltenberg last summer, just before the Washington summit. We had him in Ottawa, and I had a chance to talk with him, and he was a very impressive individual. But of course, the landscape has changed. Not only has he retired, we have a new Secretary General, Ruta, who is an excellent individual. But he is faced with a total paradigm change as a result of the election of President Trump and the change in attitudes in Washington. So I'm not obviously not privy to what is going on at NATO meetings. But we saw a couple of weeks ago when the new U.S. Defense Secretary and then the Vice President, first of all, Mr. Hesketh went to Brussels for the NATO meetings, and then Mr. Vance, the Vice President, went to the Munich summit. We've seen an alarming change of policy, and what it tells me is that Europeans, you just better individually, as collectively, yes, as part of NATO, but individually set your own strategies because you really can't count on the Americans to be, a stable partner if this kind of attitude continues.
And even though the relationship with the US currently on the defense front is challenging and unpredictable and unreliable, to say the least, at this moment in time, it has really encouraged the conversation around how we are investing in defense and security. How challenging is it to make the case for spending in defense that you've seen either in Canada or elsewhere, and what is going to resonate with citizens as governments step up their efforts on defense and security?
Well, there's only so much money that's in the pot for any country.
Yeah.
And so you have to make choices. And, one of the big crises we have in Canada, as the population ages and the kind of healthcare requirements go to sort of long-term and chronic, looking after the elderly, that's a big expenditure out of the tax dollars provincially in Canada and federally. So it's very difficult for any government, whether it's in Canada or the United States, or Britain, Ireland, for the people to decide on what the priorities are. There's only so much money in the pot. And, people are having a tough time. The economics in the last number of years is not the same as it was 30, 40 years ago, where it was really, the economy was really growing. And so the choices that people make are going to be tough. We have a healthcare crisis in Canada. We have an affordable housing crisis in Canada. But I think Ireland has the same, and Britain has the same. So the Americans have the same. So it's going to be tough to convince the citizens of individual countries that we've got to put a lot of money into defense preparedness. But if you don't, unless some kind of an arrangement can be made, and there was an arrangement in the Cold War, in a sense, it was one of attrition. That the Soviet Union had its weapons, the Americans had its weapons, no one would use it. And it was pretty peaceful if you think of it on a geopolitical scale. We don't have that now. So can we go back to that after what the Russians have done in Ukraine? I'm not so sure. So I think people are going to have to tighten their belts and agree that governments have to start spending smartly on a defense capability. And that brings into question, well, are you going to raise taxes? Are you going to cut other kinds of expenditures? And these are very difficult discussions for any government to have.
Now, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to highlight, or any trends or anything for businesses or governments to watch for in the next year or decade? Anything you can think of, David?
Well, I'm not that much of a clairvoyant. I think we really we've covered most of the challenges. But one thing I would want to leave you with today is that the whole notion of security and the essence of security after 9/11, and I was in transport at the time. I was the Minister of Transport that day when we had to land all the planes. It was easily the most traumatic day of my life. But afterwards, I was involved with my colleagues in developing a regulatory framework in dealing with bringing in 2 anti-terrorism acts. And there were a lot of people that pushed back about, well, you have a danger in what you're doing to impinge on individual liberties, individual rights. And I guess my attitude was, unless you have a secure society, it doesn't matter about liberty or individual rights. And I think people have to realize they have to ensure the the security of their own country, their own jurisdiction. Because only when you have a secure society are you able to then ensure that basic human rights, basic individual liberties are absolutely protected. And this is a trade-off that a discussion that governments are having all the time. And this is something that businesses are going to, are going to have to deal with. Well, you're proposing a certain piece of equipment to something that's going to undercut a technology that's going to undercut the rights of individuals. Well, the trouble is that so much has been developed so fast, especially with the development of AI, that everyone's playing catch up. But unless we have a framework to ensure our security, not just with physical threats of weaponry and all that, but the hybrid warfare that we've talked about, the role of AI, of foreign interference in elections, unless we have a secure system and security mechanisms in place, then we won't have to worry about individual liberties because they're going to be undermined.
Well, David, thank you very much for taking the time. It was great talking to you, and I'm sure we'll speak again. This is an issue that's not going away anytime soon and evolving almost daily, it seems. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today, and look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks for having me, Jackie. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.